is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Shalom, and welcome to the Jewish Spotlight. We're now in Manhattan at the offices of the Jewish Book Council. And we're interviewing somebody who's traveled throughout the United States, and in fact abroad, in order to be able to write a very interesting book about Chabad Lubavitch. The book is called The Rebbes Army. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to Ms. Sue Fishkoff. Ms. Fishkoff, it was a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
And we're looking forward to hearing all about what it went into writing this book. It's a fascinating book. I truly enjoyed it. It really kept my attention. But I'm a Lubavitcher, so for me it wouldn't be difficult to keep my attention. But many people I speak to, both congregants and other people, are very, very fascinated because for the first time they see the overall picture of Lubavitch. What kind of reactions are you getting to the book?
Those are the kinds of reactions that I'm getting, and frankly, I didn't write it for you or for Lubavitchers. I wrote it for people like my own family and my friends and the ordinary.
But how did you get into writing a book like this?
I used to be the Jerusalem Post reporter in New York in the early 90s, and I reported on Lubavitch then. It was the time of the Rebbe's illness, and just kept it in the back of my mind and kept writing about it periodically.
And what caused you to have such a curiosity about Chabad?
Chabad is fascinating.
Okay. I feel that way also. I'm glad you agree.
And I was fascinated not just with Chabad themselves and how successful they are. I was fascinated by the fact that I was interested in it. And what did Chabad have to say to somebody like me who's not an observant Jew?
And what did you feel that message was?
That we're all Jews.
Very
and
true.
That there's something, the Lubavitchers that I met did touch something in me. And I don't always know what it is. I don't know what it is to this day. And made me feel part of the entire Jewish family in a way I hadn't felt before.
That's great. Listen, if anything came out of the writing of the book, that itself is an accomplishment.
Yes.
Now, I know you had some fascinating stories. You did quite a lot of traveling. You went to Bangkok, you went to California, and well, you were from California. You interviewed some very interesting people there. You went to Washington, D.C. You were literally jumping from Chabad house to Chabad house. What was the common thread that you found really was the glue that kept all the Chabad houses consistent with each other as far as the message that they were bringing out to the public?
I spent a year traveling around to different Chabad houses, and I think in each place I felt the welcome, and I felt the outpouring of love to me and to other people in the community. I have a feeling that you want me to say the thread that kept them together was the Rebbe, and because I didn't know the Rebbe, I'm not sure. The Shlichim told me that it was because of the Rebbe, and whenever I would congratulate a Shliach or Shlicha on their success, they would say it's because of the Rebbe. But to me it's because of the Shlichim, and it's because of the emissaries themselves, and the dedication and the intelligence and the love that I found in the Chabad houses among the Shlichim. From every place I went, from Alaska to Florida.
It's interesting.
And that I wasn't expecting. That I didn't know about.
Did you find that many people, when they talk about Chabad, you're able to give them a little bit of a different perspective on what Chabad really is all about after you've done this inside story and you've really seen it from a different perspective? Because so many people have misconceptions about what Chabad is.
I had misconceptions.
I'm sure you did.
Yes.
Most people see us, they think it's a guy with a beard and a lady with a sheitel, and they have a Chabad house or they have a mitzvah mobile and they run around to do mitzvahs and they have no idea what's motivating them.
What was one of my misconceptions was precisely what you talked about, almost that Chabad is a quirky, otherworldly kind of organization. And the more shlichim that I met, the more emissaries that I met, the more that I realized how mainstream a part of the American Jewish community it is. Most of my research was done in America. I'm concerned with the American Jewish community.
Right.
And
that itself is an interesting fact. How it could be that a Hasidic group from Brooklyn could all of a sudden move out to these godforsaken places where there is no support system that they might be used to and become part of the mainstream. How do you explain that?
How I explain it, I'm
not
sure.
Is it explicable?
But that's what is so fascinating. The initial interest that I had came from the differentness of Chabad. And then as the fascination grew, I learned that the differentness really is combined with an ability to move among Jews and among the modern world themselves. I mean, the idea that Chabadniks are so themselves tied to this very, very high level of Judaism and of observance, and also be so flexible and welcoming to other people and able to convey what they know to people. That surprised me. I sat in on some lunch and learn sessions where rabbis would teach, and just to see their ability to teach somebody who knows nothing the very, very beginning and give over a lesson that was important.
And you felt it was done in a way that really touched that person's heart.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Interesting.
And that starts at such an early age. I spent time in Portland where there was a summer yeshiva, and I met with boys who were 15 and 16 years old who were sitting in a room with 2 or 3 Jews from the community who were old enough to be their grandparents. And these boys were teaching the older Jews in the community.
Interesting. Well, it's true that the young children in Lubavitch feel that sense of purpose and a sense of responsibility from a very young age. Now, you interviewed also a lot of very interesting leaders from other branches of Judaism, both in Reform and Conservative, and I think you had some Orthodox leaders as well.
Yes.
What was their impression of Chabad? I know some of them feel it's competition, some of them feel it's really way out, they don't relate to it at all, but did you see something that you'd like to share with us?
They all felt it was competition, and none of them thought it was way out. And that was also interesting to me. Certainly the heads of the other denominations, Reform and Conservative and Orthodox, I interviewed them all. They all had a lot to say about Chabad. They all had a personal connection in their family.
Really? That's
either
interesting.
a child who was going to Chabad, or, and that was interesting to me.
How somehow they've been touched by Chabad,
Right.
even though their own personal philosophy might not allow for that.
Exactly.
Interesting. Now, I know you've had some fascinating stories. I'm wondering if you could maybe share with us who the stories we had. Again, we're speaking to Ms. Sue Fishkoff, who's the author of the Rebbes Army, a fascinating book about Chabad Lubavitch. I'd just like to hear maybe a couple of those stories, either from the book or something that happened that didn't make it into the book.
Of course. I never knew what was going to happen to me on any given Thursday when I would take a plane to another community and go stay at a Chabad house. And one weekend I went to Alaska, to Anchorage.
Why not?
Why not? The Chabad house in Anchorage, Alaska. I wanted to go the furthest place away in America, in North America. And it was January, and it was cold, and it was dark. And at the time I went there, the Chabad rabbi in Alaska, Yossi Greenberg, was the only rabbi of any kind in the entire state. I think now there is a Reform rabbi who is working there. So he had to do all the Jewish weddings, all the bar mitzvahs, the only
How many
prayer
Jews are
services
there in Alaska?
There are about 5,000
Really?
Jews in
That
Alaska.
many?
Yes.
I know they call themselves
Yes.
the Chosen Frozen.
They do.
Oh, the Frozen Chosen.
The Frozen Chosen.
Right.
That's right. There are about 1,500 Jews in Anchorage.
Unbelievable.
And people just scattered around. And because he was the only rabbi, he had one young bar mitzvah boy whom he was teaching. Once a month, he would fly on a little plane, a little puddle jumper, out to this town
you're
called
kidding.
Wasilla. And the rabbi would get on the plane and go out there to teach this boy.
For
who lived,
one
For
boy.
one boy. This boy and his parents lived in a town where I think there was one other Jewish family in the middle of nowhere. The family was from New Mexico, and they went out to Alaska just to get away. And I went with the rabbi.
That's called getting away.
It's called getting away.
And how long did it take for him to get from his house to this person's house?
The entire trip took about 7 hours.
7 hours?
And the rabbi hates to fly. And he went there to do
7
this.
hours?
Yeah.
And he does this every month?
Did this every month.
That is incredible. That kind of dedication is just,
It's
it's mind-boggling.
me. And he was teaching the boy Aleph Bet, right, at such a level to begin to read and then to go on to learn the bar mitzvah service. And he said that he wouldn't do the bar mitzvah until the boy understood in his heart what he was teaching him. And
Right.
it wasn't just about rote learning.
Right.
And I love that.
It's that type of dedication to a fellow Jew that I think you only find in Chabad. It's not possible anyplace else. And was he paid for this?
He wasn't paid for it.
Wasn't
he did
even
it for
paid
free.
for it. And he
This is
paid
what he
for
wanted
the
to do.
trip to go there.
And it's
that
not
was it.
just dedication, because it's a sense of humor and an ability to make the Jew whom he's teaching feel comfortable with it and not feel like the Chabad rabbi's on a high level speaking down to the person.
Interesting.
This 13-year-old boy felt completely at home with the rabbi.
That's great.
And that surprised me. Lots of things surprised me.
That's great. What other stories do you have?
In Portland, when I was with the boys, getting on a bus with 20 Hasidic boys, 15, 16 years old, and they've got the hats and everything in the middle of Portland, going downtown to do wrapping of tefillin on Friday afternoon. And I
Right.
walked around with these boys, and Portland is a place where you've got your skateboarders and your punk rockers and your
Right.
people who don't know what it is. It's not New York. And to see Hasidic boys standing on a street corner and asking people in Portland,
With
"Are
total
you Jewish?"
self-confidence and
Yes.
total conviction
Yes.
and not being affected by what's going on around them.
Yes.
Interesting.
And people would come over and ask if they were Mormon, if they were Amish, and they would explain to them and talk to them. And again, it was the sense of humor and the banter back and forth with people in the streets, and the boys felt comfortable with it.
Right. I know you wrote another story also about your experience in Minnesota with Rabbi Feller. Can you share that with our audience?
Yes, because that's something that affected me. I'm not observant myself. And when I was in Minneapolis, Rabbi Feller was the founder of the Chabad house there. I spent a weekend there talking with him, and as I left, he dropped me off at the airport, Minneapolis airport. And I was hungry, and they don't serve meals on the planes anymore, as any of you know who've been flying. And I went past the little lunch counter, and I saw there a turkey and a cheese sandwich. I said, I was going to buy it, and then I thought, I didn't feel quite right after spending the weekend with Chabad that I should do this thing. And so I didn't, and I walked back to my gate to take my flight. And there was Rabbi Feller, who had dropped me off half an hour ago, running around with a little brown paper bag. He had gone home. His wife said, "You sent her off without lunch? Are you crazy?" And she packed up a little kosher lunch for me. He came back to the airplane to give me the lunch in a little brown paper bag.
Very, very nice.
And that just touched me so much that they cared about me to do that thing.
Right. What would you say to a Jew, a suburban Jew, a Jew here in the city, somebody who's Jewishly involved, but somehow Chabad seems very far off? You know, I can't associate to Chabad, or I can't be seen with Chabad or in a Chabad house, and they're just too different than my type of Judaism. What would you say to somebody like that?
See what you can learn there.
What do you mean?
Go into the Chabad house, go to an adult education class. If you're the kind of person who would say what you just said, I think you might respond to the adult education to see what you can learn from Torah. Go in and see what you think.
What did you learn?
I learned not to feel awkward walking into any Jewish setting in the world.
Interesting.
And because I'm not observant and I didn't grow up with Torah background, I felt a little awkward when I first went to Crown Heights and when I first went into an Orthodox shul. The first time I went to 770 was the first time I was in a shul with a mechitza, and that felt awkward to me. I still don't pray I pray in a conservative shul, but I feel that I have the right to be in any Jewish setting, and I feel comfortable in any Jewish setting.
And before you wouldn't have?
No. I felt there were more barriers. And because I crossed that barrier and feel comfortable with Chabad, I feel if that barrier I could cross anything I could. And so that's what I would say to the Jew. That's what I would say to my own father. Go and see what you can learn. It's for you to take and for you to learn. You're not doing anybody else any favors.
Right. Now, in your travels, I'm sure you spoke to many shluchim about the Rebbe and about their relationship with the Rebbe, how the Rebbe inspired them. Mm-hmm. How do you see the Rebbe? How do you see the Rebbe's position? How do you see the Rebbe as a leader, as a Jewish leader? You must have thought about, what kind of person is this that was able to inspire so many thousands and if not millions of people that he affected and continues to affect in terms of his teachings and everything else. What kind of impressions did you walk away with?
I was impressed with how the Rebbe affected other people. Because I didn't know the Rebbe and I never met him, and I've read nothing that he said in Yiddish or in Hebrew, only other people's interpretations of what he said.
Okay.
I myself haven't been affected by the Rebbe, but listening to both ordinary Jews and to shluchim talk about how he affected them gave me an impression. Again, it's secondhand, whereas the stories that I experienced with emissaries themselves are firsthand.
And what's that impression?
He must have been an amazing man. And I have to say that categorically because I didn't know him. But he must have been, to have been able to impress people from Elie Wiesel to a young child who I met who said she walked past him for dollars and his eyes will always remain with her. Mm-hmm. The fact that so many people talked about his eyes to me. Mm-hmm. When I look at the video, I don't see it in the same way that they must have seen it in person. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be Chabad's biggest challenge, to keep up that motivation, because all of the emissaries say to me, our success comes from the Rebbe. And I say to them, no, it comes from you. And they say it comes from us because of the Rebbe. It's the Rebbe working through us. And I have to take their word for it, because that's what they say.
All right. Very good. Now, if you had an opportunity, let's say back in the 90s, you were doing the same book, and you were investigating Chabad, and as a journalist, you were doing a story, and you had an opportunity to meet the Rebbe and to ask the Rebbe in an interview about the writing of your book. Do you have any questions that you think you would ask the Rebbe as far as understanding Chabad from that perspective?
Sure. I think I would want to know from him if he gets tired. He's got so many tens of thousands of people around the world taking energy from him, taking from him, and he's asked to give so much. I would ask, where does your energy come from? Do you get tired, and do you feel the weight of all these people on your shoulders? And how do you replenish your own energy? I would want to know that from him.
Interesting.
Because he's just one man. He was a man.
I think there was a story that that might have been in the book also, about the woman who went by the Rebbe, and you might have on a Sunday perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 people going by the Rebbe. And one woman asked the Rebbe, how do you stand on your feet for 8 hours in order to be able to give out blessings and dollar bills for the giving of charity to all these people who come by? Doesn't it get to the point where it just gets to be too much? So the Rebbe, I think, said to this individual, that's only if you look at them as every single person being an extra one or one more, but if you look at everyone as being a diamond and you're collecting diamonds, then who would be tired of collecting diamonds? And that was the love that the Rebbe had for every single human being, every single Jew, was just infinite in that sense, just an incredible, incredible experience.
And that's also Menachem Mendel Schneerson speaking as the Rebbe. I would want to know from him if the man gets tired, or if the man and the Rebbe were one person.
As a chassid, I would have to say the man and the Rebbe were one person. In fact, the Rebbe's wife said about the Rebbe that who is the Rebbe except that he belongs to the Chassidim, so to say. Everything the Rebbe had was from the Chassidim, and in terms of it, that his role as Rebbe was one and the same as a tzaddik ador, as such a great individual. But this is, I'm sure, part of a fascination that you had in terms of doing your looking into Lubavitch. Very good. Tell me, you have any other stories as far as interesting vignettes, people you spoke to in interview? Did you interview Elie Wiesel? I forget from the book if he was one of the people you got to speak to. Any other interesting people you got to speak to about your experiences?
So many. I was very interested in speaking to the shlichot, the women emissaries, because it's very typical to hear the criticism in Chabad the women are second class. And to meet so many brilliant, intelligent
very important point.
Women who are the emissaries in Connecticut, Vivi Darren, and in Binghamton, Shlonim. Yes.
And they're all over the world.
All over the world. And every shlicha that I met, for me, was just tireless. And the fact that all day the shliach and the shlicha would be working, and then at midnight they'd sit down with me to do an interview. And I would be asleep. This was in Detroit. I would be asleep all day long. The shliach is working with drug addicts and gambling addicts to try to help them because that's his work. And all day his wife, Basti Shem Tov, is working with a friendship circle. She has hundreds of teenagers who volunteer to take care of special needs children. And at midnight they sit down with me to start taping an interview, which we finish at 2:30 in the morning.
Really?
And they get up at 6. I'm asleep, and they're already in the middle of the day's work.
Tell us about your trip to Bangkok. That must have been quite an experience.
Although the book was about North America, I had to see the famous Chabad Passover Seder in Bangkok. It's in Kathmandu, it's in many places, but I went to Bangkok, where there are now 3 Chabad families, 2 Chabad families that live in Bangkok.
It's incredible. I mean, to move and pick up your family, it's amazing.
And they live with their children in the middle of the backpacker district, and they put on a Passover Seder for all the Israeli backpackers who run through the world after the army, and end up in the Far East, and they live there.
Right.
And the Passover Seder I went to had about almost 800 people,
really?
All young Israelis who would never set foot in a synagogue, much less a Chabad house home in Israel, and who felt a tremendous barrier. But they were away from home, and they wanted a Passover Seder.
And Chabad was the only place to get it.
And boy, were they surprised at how lovely it was.
So what happened to them? Did you see a transition going on as you were seeing these kids go through the day?
No, I didn't see a transition. What I saw was Israeli kids feeling the importance of their family and their roots, and singing Hebrew songs with fun, with gusto, and not being embarrassed about it, whereas I'm sure at home they would be. And just being Israelis together and being able to do that at the Passover table. I was only there a week. Hopefully you don't create a Baal Tshuva in a week if you do there's something
no,
wrong.
I mean that kind of transition, exactly, exactly.
Right.
And as you know, in Nepal, Kathmandu, the same time, there's a Seder for almost, I hear, 1,800 Israelis that takes place there. And that really is a very famous Seder that some Israelis specifically go to the Far East during that time of year in order to be able to be part of the Chabad Seder because it's such a famous Seder.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and last year when I was there in Bangkok, we spoke to the yeshiva boys who came back from Nepal after the Kathmandu Seder.
Really?
And they said all of the food at the last minute had been ruined because it was very interesting. In the hotel, to save energy, the hotel had been unplugging the refrigerator at night because who needs food at night and then plugging it in the morning.
Unbelievable.
So at the very last minute, they had to get together food for these 1,500 people, and they did it. They did it somehow, and they cooked it like in the last 2 hours before it was time.
Incredible. You know, we're talking with Sue Fishkoff, who's the author of The Rebbes Army, a book about Chabad Lubavitch. And I just want to go on to another part of the world, because you mentioned about doing the impossible. I know in the book also you talked about some of the things that happen in Washington, D.C., behind the scenes with Rabbi Shem Tov and the things that he's doing as far as working with consulates and ambassadors, diplomats, politicians, senators, House of Representatives. And can you give us a little insight, because that's a completely different type of work than we usual shluchim who are from around the field are involved in.
Absolutely. Rabbi Shem Tov, Levi Shem Tov, who's in D.C., he has his own work, of course, with the local Jews, but he's also Chabad representative in Washington, so he deals with congressmen and senators about the American Jewish scene, and also with ambassadors from other countries. And it was astonishing for me to see the range of ambassadors with whom he's on first-name basis.
So did you spend some time with him? You actually went around during the day with him?
I'd spent one day with him where we went through the Capitol building and met with some senators and met with some ambassadors.
Right.
And my question to them and to him was, why do they treat him as an ambassador of the Jewish people when he's not elected to any political office? And they respond to something that he's giving them. They respond to his sincerity.
So what was the answer? Oh, that they respond to his sincerity?
They do.
Interesting.
They do. They're fascinated by it in the same way that I was. That here is this man who is so committed to a very strict Jewish life and who yet is completely part of the modern world and completely able to negotiate the halls of power in Washington. And that tickles us somehow. How can that be? How can you do both?
You know, I think also that one part of Chabad that people don't understand is the deep philosophy, the deep theology behind the movement. The Chabad stands for Chacham Bina Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And it's a particular approach to understanding Judaism, our role as Jews, our purpose as Jews, and not just as Jews, but for all humanity. Exactly what is the purpose of humanity? Why did God create this world? How do we find God in the world? But in a very intellectual approach which incorporates the emotional and also deep spiritual values. And it's that aspect, that dimension, which for us as Chabad Hasidim is really a tremendous amount of the content, the motivating force with the Rebbe and with all the different factors together to be the drive to bring us to these situations. So when people look at these situations you talk about, whether it be Rabbi Shem Tov being able to mix into DC so easily, or Rabbi Cantor in Bangkok being able to do what he's doing, or all the other shluchim, there's this fountain of the Rebbe's inspiration and the wisdom of the Torah and the beauty of Chassidut, which gives us this tremendous well to draw on in order to be able to apply it whatever the situation might be, wherever we might go around the world. I know you're also in Florida. And in Florida, Chabad is literally growing by leaps and bounds. It's a new community, relatively speaking, growing constantly. And in fact, you interviewed one of our very good friends, Mrs. Nita Kaufman, who is one of our supporters from Long Island, who is very instrumental in building the Chabad house in Boca. And that's a completely different type of setting than what we've talked about now, where you have a solid, very established Jewish community where Chabad, for all practical purposes, is really part of the mainstream. And you have Chabad in the mainstream in many countries, but in the States there are not that many places that would necessarily be as much the mainstream as perhaps in Florida. What was your reaction to that?
It was interesting to see, and actually Boca, although it's an established Jewish community, it's very new.
Right.
There was only one synagogue in Boca 15 years ago, and now I think there are 19 or 20.
Sure, it's incredible.
So Chabad came at the same time as all the other congregations. And I enjoyed seeing Chabad be part of the mainstream and not shoved off into a corner. And the fact that they sat together in rabbinic boards and tried to work with, and there was a lot of interplay, people going back and forth from the Chabad house to some of the other congregations and being able to learn from each other.
Right.
The local Orthodox rabbi in Boca teaches a class together with one of
Really?
the Chabad rabbis.
Very nice.
And I thought that was very, very good, where they taught each other about their own wise men.
Right.
And that was a good thing.
Interesting. Now, I know you're familiar a little bit with Chabad in Russia as well, although it wasn't in the book. Can you just tell the audience a little bit about what's going on in Russia as far as Chabad's incredible growth there and the phenomenon that's taking place there now?
Chabad was the first Jewish organization to be in the Soviet Union after the collapse of the Soviet Union and be concerned with Jewish spirituality. The joint distribution community went in right away to take care of welfare needs. And the Chabad rabbis and their wives have just been showing up in cities and looking for Jews and finding them. That's what's so astonishing.
The numbers
and
are incredible.
Yes, and working closely with the
With
joint
JDC, I know, right.
for the welfare.
It's been a great partnership.
And what's been beautiful is to see some of the Russian-born Jews now learn with Chabad and then go back to serve the communities.
Right. It's really a chapter in Jewish history that is yet to be written, because it's something that most people are not aware of, the incredible phenomena that's going on in Russia. Of course, there was a massive exodus, but for the Jews that remain, it's really amazing. Nobody would have imagined, except for the Rebbe. The Rebbe foresaw it, and the Rebbe prepared for it, and the Rebbe had the underground network going constantly in order to be able to make sure that the time would come where this would be able to take place. So we're almost finished, and I just want to know if you have a last saying that you, in terms of the meaning that this book has to you on a personal level, in terms of its message, in terms of what you wanted to accomplish with it, as far as what you would like people to walk away from once they read your book.
I hope that they will tear down some of their own internal barriers between Jews. And I think that our American Jewish community is really too strictly delineated among denominations, and you don't have to put labels on yourself. I'm a Reform, I'm a Conservative, I'm an Orthodox. And if I can make Jews feel more comfortable with each other and be more welcoming to each other, I think that's a lesson I learned from Chabad. And to remember that, you know, in Judaism it's about visiting the sick and giving tzedakah and living Jewish values.
Very nice. Well, that's beautiful. That's very beautiful. And I think if you can accomplish that, it'll be a major accomplishment, because there's no question there's a need for it. And as we know, the Rebbe would often say that a Jew is a Jew is a Jew, and there's no such thing as a Hasidic soul, a Reformed soul, a Conservative soul, or an Orthodox soul. We come into this world to fulfill a purpose, and we have a lofty purpose, a wonderful purpose to fulfill, and that's really part of the beauty of life itself. And the Rebbe always taught that lesson to everybody and never looked at labels as well. I want to thank you very much for being with us, and again I want to thank the Jewish Book Council for hosting us here in the city. And in the meantime, maybe take up Sue's challenge. First of all, I think you should get the book. If you haven't read it yet, it's printed or published by Shakin Books, and it's a beautiful book. It's by Sue Fishkoff, The Rebbes Army. And please try your best to go out and get it. It should be available on Amazon and, of course, all the major bookstores. In the meantime, try what Sue said. Knock down a couple of barriers. Think of a Jew that maybe you had a thought of. Don't go by it. Do something Jewish.